Sandringham House, Norfolk, February 6, 1952, 7:30 in the morning. A valet enters King George VI's bedroom to wake him and finds him dead. The curtains haven't been drawn. The room is still. George VI has been dead for hours. A coronary thrombosis in his sleep. No sound, no struggle that anyone in the house heard. He is 56 years old. His last public appearance had been 6 days earlier at London Airport, standing on the tarmac in the winter cold, watching his daughter's plane until it disappeared into the clouds above Heathrow. He had stood there longer than protocol required. The household at Sandringham absorbed the news in the way that large establishments absorb catastrophe, through a particular kind of controlled stillness, word moving from room to room, while the building itself remained outwardly unchanged. His private secretary was informed. The Prime Minister was informed. A doctor was summoned to confirm what was already known. The Accession Council convened at St. James's Palace at 5 o'clock that afternoon, before the new Queen had even left Africa. 5,000 miles away, in the highlands of Kenya, Princess Elizabeth was beginning an ordinary morning. She and Prince Philip had spent the previous night at Treetops, a game viewing lodge built into an enormous fig tree overlooking a salt lick and watering hole near the Aberdare forest. They had stayed up in the darkness watching rhinoceros and elephant move below them in the flickering light. It was, by her own description, one of the most thrilling experiences of her life. They'd come back to Sagana Lodge in the early morning, a low, comfortable house in the hills that had been a wedding gift from the Kenyan government, where the light came in cool and clear off the surrounding forest, where the ordinary machinery of a royal tour was preparing to resume. The news didn't reach her immediately. It traveled by wire from Norfolk to Nairobi, then to her private secretary, Martin Charteris, who had been carrying a draft accession declaration in his briefcase since October 1951, prepared against exactly this possibility. A senior courtier reached Philip's aid. Philip's aide reached Philip, and then Philip went to find his wife. Several accounts place him outside with her, walking. The words exchanged between them haven't survived in any form that reached the historical record. What is documented is what came after. She returned to the house composed, sat down at a desk, and began the work of being a queen. She signed the necessary papers. She issued the necessary orders. By evening, proclamations were being prepared across 7 Commonwealth realms. Jim Corbett, the British hunter staying at the lodge, wrote in the visitor's book before the party departed, "For the first time in the history of the world, a young girl climbed into a tree one day, a princess, and after having what she described as her most thrilling experience, she climbed down from the tree next day, a queen." That entry captures the symmetry of the moment in the way that good witnesses sometimes do. Clean, a little elegiac, entirely true. But it tells only half the story. At the exact moment Elizabeth II came down from that tree, a queen, someone else's world ended. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, had been Queen Consort of the United Kingdom for 15 years and 3 months. She had been the wife, the ballast, the public face, the emotional spine, and, by the documented accounts of historians who studied her correspondence, the quiet political force behind a king who came to the throne unexpectedly, stammered through his speeches, and privately depended on her more than the official record ever fully admitted. She was 51 years old. She was standing at Sandringham, in the same building where her husband's body lay, in rooms she had organized and animated for 15 years. Every formal role she had ever held had just ceased to exist. Britain gained a young queen on February 6, 1952. Inside the family, the situation was considerably more complicated. To understand what Elizabeth II inherited from her mother, not the crown, but the problem, you first need to understand what her mother had actually been. Not the image of a sweet grandmother in a pastel coat, which is how Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon would be remembered by the time she died at 101. The actual function she performed, and the degree to which that function had made her genuinely, structurally, indispensable. She became Queen Consort on December 11, 1936, the day her husband's older brother abdicated to marry Wallis Simpson. Prince Albert, Duke of York, Bertie to his family, had never wanted the throne. He had a stammer that had affected his public speaking since childhood, a nervous facial tic, and a crisis of confidence that was self-reinforcing. The stammer fed the anxiety, and the anxiety fed the stammer. He came to kingship via a constitutional catastrophe that left the country shaken, following a predecessor whose popularity had been enormous and whose departure was humiliating. He had not been prepared for sovereignty. He had been prepared, at best, for a supporting role. Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon had known all of this before she married him. She had turned down his proposal twice, not because she didn't care for him, but because, as she wrote to a friend at the time, she was afraid of never again being free to think, speak, and act as she felt she ought. Once she agreed, in January 1923, she made a decision that is worth stating plainly. She gave up that freedom, and gave it up completely. The partnership that resulted wasn't merely a marriage. It was a functional unit with a specific public purpose. She managed the social obligations he found exhausting. She compensated, in rooms full of diplomats and heads of state, for the stammer that made him dread extended conversation. She understood, instinctively and early, that her task wasn't to be separately brilliant, but to make him adequate to the role history had unexpectedly assigned him. Historian Piers Brendan characterized the relationship in a phrase that has attached itself to the standard account. The Queen Mother provided the kind of backbone that the king had lacked. That formulation is accurate, but slightly understates what the research documents. Historian Kenneth Rose recorded a specific, recurring pattern in how the court operated. George VI would have a discussion with his private secretary, Sir Alan Lascelles, issue an instruction, and return the following morning having changed his mind entirely. The strong inference Rose drew, based on the consistency of the pattern, was that the Queen had persuaded him to revise it overnight. She didn't attend cabinet meetings. She didn't sign state papers. Her influence operated through proximity and through the particular authority of a woman who understood her husband better than any minister could. Over years, biographers documented how she shaped his political instincts, pushing him gradually toward her own conservative positions, providing the confidence that his public duties required, but that he couldn't always generate alone. She was also, by 1938 and into the war, operating at a level that went beyond her husband entirely. In the summer of 1938, she and George VI made a state visit to France, designed to shore up Anglo-French solidarity against the gathering threat from Germany. The French press praised the king and queen, but it was her specifically they lingered on. Her demeanor, her wardrobe, her ability to turn formal diplomatic occasions into something that felt personal. The following year, they toured Canada from coast to coast, the first time a reigning British monarch had visited, then crossed into the United States to meet Franklin Roosevelt. Eleanor Roosevelt watched her work through their time at the White House and came away with an assessment that was precise in the way only mild skepticism produces. Elizabeth was perfect as a queen, gracious, informed, saying the right thing and kind, but a little self-consciously regal. The tour achieved its diplomatic purpose, building transatlantic support before a war that was clearly coming. She told the Canadian Prime Minister afterward, "That tour made us." When the Blitz started in 1940, the cabinet urged her to evacuate the children to Canada. Her answer was recorded and repeated until it became a kind of national shorthand. "The children won't go without me. I won't leave the king, and the king will never leave." They stayed in London. She and George VI visited bombed neighborhoods in the East End, in Coventry, in the port cities, the places where the damage was heaviest and the grief freshest. Her early visits provoked real hostility. Rubbish was thrown. Crowds jeered. She arrived in expensive clothes to see people who had lost everything, and the gap was noticed. She had a response to this, and it wasn't a rationalization. If people came to see her, she said, they wore their best clothes, so she should reciprocate. Her dressmaker, Norman Hartnell, began dressing her in what he called the rainbow of hope. Gentle, cheerful colors, nothing black, nothing that amplified the grief already in the streets. When Buckingham Palace itself was bombed in September 1940, she was present. For 3 of the 9 bomb strikes on the palace, she and the king were in the building. She later said, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The line worked because it wasn't performance. During the phony war, she had taken revolver training in the palace gardens because an invasion was genuinely expected. She wasn't managing public perception from a safe distance. She was in the rooms when the windows shattered. One woman who encountered her on a bombed street wrote to Barbara Cartland afterward. She said to me, "I am so sorry. I know what you are feeling." It was like the voice of an angel. There's never been a lady like her. That kind of testimony, multiplied across thousands of encounters over 5 years of war, accumulated into something that couldn't be manufactured, a genuine, sustained, personal bond between a royal woman and a nation in extremity. By 1945, she was the emotional center of the wartime monarchy. She had turned royal visibility from a formality into a political asset. The public loved her in a way that had become almost independent of the throne itself. It attached to her personally, to her warmth and presence, to the woman rather than the role. For 15 years, she was the first woman in the royal family, first in rooms, first in precedence, first in the affections of a court that had organized its social and ceremonial rhythms around her. Then, at 7:30 on a February morning, she wasn't anything. Her husband was dead, and her daughter was queen. There was no transition period, no handover, no gradual adjustment. At the moment George VI's heart stopped, Elizabeth II became sovereign, and her mother became, in the constitutional sense, a private subject, a subject whose status now depended on her daughter's goodwill to sustain. 3 days after her husband's funeral, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon issued a press statement. She would be known as Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother. The title wasn't formally conferred by royal instrument. She chose it herself and announced it publicly. The designation was partly practical. There were now 2 Queen Elizabeths, and the country needed a way to distinguish them. But it was also a woman who had spent 15 years being called the Queen, trying to negotiate, in a press release, some dignified space within the new order. The title Queen Mother had no constitutional existence. It had been used occasionally in English since the early 1560s, but it carried no formal power and conferred no formal privilege. She was describing herself into existence. Biographer Christopher Warwick was more direct about what lay underneath the dignified language. "The Queen Mother," he wrote, "minded very much being the Queen Mother." She was, in Warwick's assessment, jealous of her daughter having become queen. And then the line that cuts to the bone. She felt they'd been cut off in her prime. She loved the position of being queen, and suddenly all that was taken from her. Taken from her at 51, not old, nowhere near the end of an active life, and she knew it. She would live another 50 years. The grief for her husband was real and total. She had loved him and organized her entire existence around sustaining him through 15 years of a role he'd never wanted. And now he was gone, and everything that had given shape to her days was gone with him. She was described as devastated in the weeks after the death. grief-stricken in a way that alarmed the household. She retreated to Scotland. For roughly 8 months, from February to late autumn 1952, she withdrew almost entirely from public life. Winston Churchill, who had known her since before the abdication crisis, visited her in Scotland in the autumn to encourage her back. It worked, eventually. Before she returned to anything resembling routine, she made a purchase that reveals the state she was in more precisely than any testimony from those months. In 1952, while grieving, she bought a castle. The Castle of May stands at the northernmost tip of mainland Scotland, looking across the Pentland Firth toward the Orkney Islands. When she found it in the summer of 1952, it was a dilapidated 16th-century structure facing demolition. The owner unable to maintain it, the restoration costs daunting. No obvious institutional reason for a royal widow to acquire a crumbling fortress at the edge of Britain. It was remote, cold, and expensive to restore. She bought it anyway. She spent 3 weeks there every August and about 10 days every October for the rest of her life. More importantly, it was the only property she ever owned outright. Everything else she lived in, Buckingham Palace while she remained there, Royal Lodge Windsor, and later Clarence House, belonged to the institution. May was hers. A property that made no practical sense whatsoever, purchased in the most disorienting months of her life, because it was the one thing she could hold that nobody could take back. She also, more quietly and more consequentially, didn't leave Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth II and Philip had been living at Clarence House, a 4-story mansion near St. James's Palace that had been their home since 1949, where their children had grown up, where Elizabeth had built the only domestic life she'd managed to construct outside the formal ceremonial machine. She wanted to stay. Churchill told her no. She was the sovereign. She belonged at Buckingham Palace, which meant that for 15 months between George VI's death and the coronation in June 1953, Buckingham Palace still contained the previous queen. The Queen Mother remained at the palace while her daughter lived at Clarence House. The institutional apparatus of the building, the staff, the household rhythms, the daily operations of a palace that had organized itself around her for 15 years, was still physically centered on the woman who had organized it. She finally moved to Clarence House in May 1953, roughly 6 weeks before the coronation, into the house that had been Elizabeth II's family home, the place where Prince Charles had lived until he was 3. Her private verdict on the new arrangement was recorded in sources close to the household. The house was small and horrid. The young queen faced something no constitutional document could prepare her for. She held every sovereign power. She had the red boxes, the prime ministers, the state papers, the formal weight of the throne. From the moment of her father's death, she was the monarch. But the court she inherited, its social rhythms, its emotional allegiances, the network of aristocratic loyalists who had spent 15 years deferring to her mother, didn't reorganize overnight simply because the title had transferred. Ben Pimlett, whose biography of Elizabeth II is the most rigorous academic account of the early reign, noted that she found herself castigated for allegedly allowing herself to be influenced by Tory aristocrats and elderly courtiers in those first years. The implication is that the old court remained the old court, and its gravitational center had not yet fully shifted to the new queen. Her mother's approach to royal life was warm, social, relational, theatrical in the best sense. She commanded rooms through charm and personal attention, through the particular gift she had for making individuals feel genuinely attended to. One biographer's assessment of her as possessing an instinctive understanding of what people wanted of a queen consort wasn't a dismissal. It was an accurate description of a political skill built over decades. Elizabeth II's approach was different, more reserved, more formal, more focused on the mechanics of duty than on its performance. Robert Lacey observed that she had a particular unease with rehearsals, with managed spontaneity. Where her mother moved through public life with apparent warmth and ease, the new queen moved with precision and a slight opacity. The contrast registered in the court, and registered as a kind of deficit, unfairly but persistently, in the early years when comparison was inevitable. The contrast wasn't simply temperamental, it was also structural. Elizabeth II was 25 years old, newly sovereign, still learning the machinery of the role, surrounded by men who had served her father and who had formed their professional habits within a court that still emotionally orbited the woman who had organized it, Alan Tommy Lascelles, who had served as George VI's private secretary and continued briefly in that role for Elizabeth II until 1953, was the living embodiment of this transition. A man described as the reluctant courtier who made sure the royal family never changed, navigating between two queens and belonging, in his formation, to the world of the first. The most visible instance of the double bind came in November 1952, when Group Captain Peter Townsend, a decorated RAF officer, former equerry to the king and a divorced man, told the Queen and Philip that he was in love with Princess Margaret. This forced Elizabeth into an impossible position that her mother's continued centrality made harder rather than easier. She was simultaneously the sovereign who held constitutional authority over her sister's marriage choices under the Royal Marriages Act, and a daughter and sister navigating the emotional pressures of a family still gathered around her mother's grief and her mother's values. The Queen Mother objected to Margaret's involvement with Townsend, and the objection carried weight in ways that official communications don't record. When a grieving woman who has organized the family's moral atmosphere for decades makes her disapproval known, the sovereign, who is also that woman's daughter, can't simply override it by fiat. Elizabeth II navigated the Townsend crisis over 3 years, absorbing pressure from the Church of England, from Churchill and then Eden as Prime Minister, from the press, from her own conscience, and from the accumulated expectations of a family whose framework for these questions had been set largely by the woman at Clarence House. Margaret announced in October 1955 that she wouldn't marry Townsend. Elizabeth II was technically in command throughout. She was also emotionally the child of the woman whose disapproval filled the room. Prince Philip is the most useful lens for understanding the old court's resistance to the new reign, because his frustrations are the most documented and the most direct. He was, by every account, deeply uncomfortable with what he found after the accession. One source close to him put it plainly: life at court was very frustrating for him at first. He already knew the courtiers were pompous. He'd known it before the accession, and the change from heir presumptive's household to sovereign's household made it worse. The palace he inherited alongside his wife was staffed and run according to habits that hadn't changed since before the war, by men whose professional identities had been formed within the world the Queen Mother represented. Philip wanted to modernize. He wanted to reorganize the royal estates, question the long-standing traditions, and, as Robert Lacey would describe it, make the monarchy less like what the Queen Mother's Clarence House was still maintaining, unashamedly harking back to when Britain had an empire, charming, aristocratic, frankly snobbish, no pretense of actually living in the 20th century. Philip had no patience for that description. He pulled the footmen who had been responsible for carrying messages between royals and replaced them with telephones at Buckingham Palace. The Queen Mother's response to this was documented by Lacey. She took umbrage. The footmen weren't merely messengers. They were part of the social texture of a world she understood, a visible signal of what kind of household this was and what kind of family ran it. Telephones were efficient. That was precisely the objection. Her circle had a name for Philip. Multiple biographers, including Giles Brandreth and Sarah Bradford, documented that the Queen Mother and those around her used the word "the enemy" to describe him. Whether that word was ever used in Elizabeth II's hearing isn't recorded. That it circulated in rooms where her husband was discussed is established. The most pointed institutional conflict of the early reign was the question of the family name. Philip had renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles to marry Elizabeth, taking the name Mountbatten from his mother's British family. When she became queen, he expected the royal house to be renamed Mountbatten. In 1952, the cabinet decided firmly that the queen would retain Windsor. Philip's response, recorded by his biographer Basil Boothroyd, was direct. "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." Both Lord Mountbatten and the Queen Mother were identified in sources as key parties in the name discussions, and Churchill, deeply personally loyal to the Queen Mother and to the Windsor continuity she represented, worked, according to documented accounts, with her to restrict Philip's influence in the household during his final years as Prime Minister. He resigned in April 1955. Philip eventually got a partial resolution. An order in council in February 1960 established that their descendants not carrying royal titles would bear the name Mountbatten Windsor. 8 years to give his name to his own children. What Philip experienced openly, with considerable audible frustration, was a concentrated version of what Elizabeth II navigated more quietly every day. He had the temperament for direct conflict. She had been trained, by her mother among others, not to show it. Clarence House, after May 1953, wasn't a private residence in any ordinary sense. It was a functioning royal household with its own staff, its own social calendar, and its own gravitational pull on the people who had formed their professional and personal lives within the previous reign. The Queen Mother maintained roughly 60 domestic staff. She had her own ladies-in-waiting, women who had been her contemporaries for decades, who had served in or around the wartime household, whose social connections ran through the same aristocratic and diplomatic circles she had inhabited since the 1920s. Authors who gained access to her inner circle described arriving at Clarence House for lunches that felt like genuine gatherings of an old court. The warmth, the conversation, the particular social ease of a woman who had been the natural center of every room she entered for 30 years and had no intention of stopping. Princess Margaret lived there with her mother from 1953 until her own marriage in 1960, which concentrated additional family complexity at that address. The place that was, on paper, a residence for a widowed queen and her unmarried daughter, functioned as the emotional center of gravity for a significant part of the royal family's private life. Horse racing provided the Queen Mother with a social network that extended far beyond the palace walls. She had loved racing since before the war, and after 1952, she invested in it heavily, as an owner of steeplechasers, as a participant and a presence at courses across Britain. The racing world has its own aristocracy, its own loyalties, its own press relationships, and she was central to it in ways that reinforced her public visibility at exactly the times when other members of the family were managing controversy. She was also genuinely good at it. She attended meetings well into her 90s, and the racecourse crowds greeted her with a warmth that politicians paid large sums trying to manufacture. Churchill remained a regular presence in her world throughout his last years in office. He had watched her hold the wartime monarchy together from inside its engine room. His emotional attachment to her was genuine and returned. When he left Downing Street in April 1955, he was leaving the political proximity that had given him formal influence, but he wasn't leaving the world the Queen Mother represented. He was retiring into it. After her withdrawal from public life ended in late 1952, the Queen Mother rebuilt with a disciplined efficiency that was easy to overlook because it looked so natural. She became patron or president of 350 organizations. She made more than 40 official visits abroad. Historians called her the first working queen mother, the first former queen consort who, rather than retreating into dignified invisibility, constructed an active public life calibrated to her particular gifts. The warmth that had made her central during the war didn't diminish with age. She directed it outward at charity events and hospital openings and racing stables, and the public responded every time. In November 1953, Parliament adjusted a law to allow her to deputize for the Queen on official duties when the sovereign was out of the country. The practical logic was real. Elizabeth II traveled frequently on Commonwealth tours. The effect was to give the Queen Mother a legal mechanism for continued institutional relevance that no merely senior relative would have required. She had no formal constitutional role. She now had a statute that placed her in the sovereign's chair when necessary. Her relationship with Prince Charles deepened through the 1950s and 1960s in ways that extended her influence into the next generation. Multiple biographers documented a close, nurturing, emotionally rich bond between grandmother and heir, structured around the long visits to Clarence House and the Castle of May that Charles described as formative. She transmitted to him the values of the world she had come from, the wartime generation's understanding of what monarchy was for, the old court's instinctive conservatism, the particular weight that tradition carried for people who had survived on tradition during the worst crisis of the century. Those values weren't wrong. They were also precisely the values that Philip had found suffocating, and they were now being woven into the formation of the next sovereign. Elizabeth II was managing, in a precise and documentable sense, the situation of watching her mother shape the future of the institution she was currently trying to modernize. The domestic arithmetic of all of this was impossible in the specific way that only love can make things impossible. Elizabeth II spoke to her mother every day. Not occasionally, not on occasions. Every day, by telephone, for 50 years, from the accession until the Queen Mother's last years. That daily contact was simultaneously an act of love and a structural reality. The Queen Mother had regular access to the sovereign. Whatever was said in those conversations hasn't survived in any documented form, because the royal family didn't speak about its difficulties, and because even private correspondence could vanish. Princess Margaret destroyed letters from Diana to the Queen Mother after the Queen Mother's death, on the grounds that they were so private. The daily calls are confirmed. Their content isn't. Robert Lacey's work records that the Queen Mother instructed her children that duty always came first. This was the organizing principle she had lived by and the conviction she had stamped on her daughter's formation. Elizabeth II absorbed it more completely than anyone. She made duty the spine of her entire life and reign. But the same instruction that made her a formidable sovereign also made it impossible for her to say cleanly, in any direct or confrontational way, that her mother's continued centrality was creating difficulties. You can't tell a grieving woman who raised you that her grief is inconvenient. You can't tell the person who taught you duty that her love has become a constraint, especially when she hasn't done anything wrong, when the problem isn't malice or scheming. It's love and grief, and the particular psychology of a woman whose entire adult identity had been built around being indispensable. The financial dimension of the Queen Mother's widowhood added a material reality to what might otherwise seem purely emotional. Gareth Russell, the royal historian, summarized it in 3 words that contain multitudes. The Queen did despair of her mother's spending. The Guardian's obituary, published in 2002, captured the arc of her financial life in a headline that referenced style, opulence, and overdrafts. She maintained 3 residences simultaneously: Clarence House in London, the Castle of May in Scotland, purchased out of grief and restored at her own expense, and Royal Lodge, Windsor, her weekend home with Princess Margaret. She entertained constantly. She kept racehorses in training throughout her life. Her lifestyle was, as The Guardian noted, that of the aristocratic era she had inhabited since childhood, maintained without material adjustment for the fact that the formal role historically justifying that lifestyle had ended in February 1952. Elizabeth II applied to the High Court to keep her mother's will confidential after her death in 2002. The application was granted. The sensitivity around the finances didn't require much interpretation. This wasn't unique to the Queen Mother as a personality. She was living the only life she had ever known, supported by an institution that had organized her existence for 30 years. She had never managed household finances as a private person. She didn't know how. The problem wasn't deliberate extravagance. The problem was that her continuation required active institutional decisions about money, about residences, about staff, that placed Elizabeth II in the position of managing her own mother's welfare as a constitutional and financial matter. A queen governing the costs of her own mother's household, the Crown gave her authority over every aspect of British public life. It didn't make that part straightforward. The title of this story uses the word enemy, which is compression for something that resists compression. The Queen Mother was Elizabeth's obstacle through love and grief, and the particular way a woman whose entire identity had been built around being first found it almost impossible to become second. She didn't rebel. She didn't have to. She simply continued being exactly who she was, adored, warm, well-connected, expensive to maintain, and immovably central to the family's emotional life, and left Elizabeth II to manage the complications that produced. Elizabeth II didn't handle any of this loudly. There was no confrontation, no documented moment of rupture, no royal drama that left traces in the historical record. The royal family didn't speak about its difficulties, and the evidence left behind is oblique. A phrase here, an observation there, an accumulation of small, controlled decisions that add up to something larger than any single element. What she did was establish separation, not from love. The daily calls continued, and Elizabeth was at her mother's bedside when she died on March 30th, 2002, at Royal Lodge, Windsor, aged 101, 7 weeks after Princess Margaret's death. But a professional institutional separation, built over years and never announced, that gradually created distinct orbits within the same family. 2 separate royal circuits emerged by the mid-1950s and deepened through the following decade. The Queen's Circuit was the machinery of constitutional monarchy: Commonwealth tours, state visits, Privy Council meetings, the Red Boxes, the Prime Ministers cycling through Buckingham Palace. The Queen Mother's Circuit was warmer and more personal: charitable patronages, racing engagements, Clarence House lunches, the Commonwealth relationships she maintained through individual friendships rather than state protocol. They overlapped at family occasions and public ceremonies. They shared the same bloodline and the same deep investment in the institution's survival. But they weren't the same orbit. The emotional reserve that became Elizabeth II's defining quality, the characteristic that biographers spent decades trying to read, that critics called coldness and supporters called extraordinary discipline, has multiple sources. The institutional training of her generation, the demands of constitutional monarchy, her own temperament. Whether the specific pressure of her mother's centrality in the early years contributed to its development isn't something the record settles precisely. What can be said is that she developed, through the 1950s and into the 1960s, a mode of sovereign presence that was precisely not her mother's mode. Where the Queen Mother was warm, instinctively theatrical, and personally expressive, Elizabeth II was contained, reliable, and deliberately opaque. A monarch who expresses nothing specific can't easily be read. A mother can't easily reach her. She applied the lesson her mother had taught her, duty above all, so completely that it eventually governed the relationship through which she had first learned it. In March 2002, Princess Margaret died. She had been ill for some time, weakened by a series of strokes. 7 weeks later, on March 30th, the Queen Mother died at Royal Lodge, Windsor, at the age of 101, with her surviving daughter at her bedside. The two women who had most profoundly shaped the royal family's emotional texture for half a century, a grieving widow who had rebuilt herself into a national institution, and the daughter who had quietly and carefully established her own sovereignty within the same family, were both gone within the same season. Elizabeth II attended her mother's funeral at Westminster Abbey on April 9, 2002, in the composed silence the world had long come to expect from her. She then applied to the High Court to seal the will. The paradox of the Queen Mother's later life is real, and it has the weight of actual history behind it. In her 50 years of public life after 1952, she was genuinely valuable to the monarchy she had helped build. She rehabilitated the role of Queen Mother from dignified retirement into an active working position, becoming patron or president of 350 organizations and making over 40 official visits abroad. She maintained a public warmth and visibility that held steady even when other members of the family were managing declining approval ratings and accumulating press criticism. She kept faith with a version of royal life, gracious, committed to public service, personally attentive, that made the crown seem worth preserving. Her longevity itself was an institutional argument. A woman who attended public engagements into her late 90s was living proof of the durability of the institution she had served. She also, simultaneously, made it harder for her daughter to fully inhabit the role she had inherited. Through love and grief and the particular psychology of a woman whose entire adult identity had been constructed around being indispensable to a king and central to a court. She didn't rebel against the new order. She didn't need to. She simply remained exactly what she had always been: adored, influential, warm, expensive, charming, and immovably present in the family's emotional life, and left the consequences for Elizabeth II to manage. The crown Elizabeth II received on February 6, 1952, gave her authority over governments, parliaments, ministers, ceremonies, and the constitutional machinery of 7 sovereign countries. It didn't give her easy authority over the woman who had shaped her, grieved beside her, called her every morning for 50 years, and remembered, with perfect clarity, exactly when she had been only a daughter. Elizabeth II became sovereign over Britain in a single day, becoming sovereign over her own family, over a mother who outlived her husband by 50 years, who built a shadow court at Clarence House, who spent what the institution couldn't quite afford to refuse, who loved her daughter with a completeness that made stepping back genuinely impossible, took the rest of her life. Sometimes the person most in the way of a queen is the mother who still remembers when she was only a girl. Subscribe for more stories like this.